on, everybody? Welcome to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours for Tuesday, June 15th, 2021. If you are watching us live or if you are watching the recording of this back later, thank you for tuning in. This is a live Q&A style show where we answer questions from our users about DFS, about SaberSim, about sports betting, about really whatever you guys want to talk about live here on stream. We do this live for a reason, because we want follow-up questions and we want clarifying questions, and we want this to be kind of conversational. We want you guys to be a part of the conversation here. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask or anything that you want to just chime into the conversation overall, you can pop those into either YouTube chat or into our Office Hours channel on Slack. If you are not currently in our Slack channel and you'd like to be involved, there is a link in the description of this video if you're watching the recording. Otherwise, if you're watching us live, go ahead and shoot us an email to support@sabersim.com. We'll get you an email into... we'll send you an email with a link to get into our Slack community. There's a lot of great conversation going on every single day in Slack. I highly recommend joining. That is also where our Office Hours channel lives, where a lot of these conversations start. So highly recommend it. I mentioned this is a daily show. We host the show every day at 2 p.m. Eastern here. We talk about the slates and the games we have going on that day to talk about overall DFS strategy and things like that. This is not a tout show. This is not a pick show. But we will use the slates we have for that day to talk about some things and talk about strategy and our approach and things like that, and how to use SaberSim to build winning lineups for the slates we have that day. Typically on Thursdays, we use this time for a strategy session where we go do a deep dive into a specific concept or sport or game type. We typically bring in some other members of the SaberSim team. So posted on YouTube now are our last 3 weeks of strategy sessions. They are sports betting, NBA short slates and showdowns, and esports, specifically League of Legends and Counter-Strike. So if you are interested in any of those, I will be referencing a few of those today, but I highly recommend going and checking the recordings on our YouTube channel for those 3 strategy sessions. And I'm very excited to say that tomorrow we will be doing a strategy session for the US Open. We will be talking about PGA DFS, particularly for majors and also particularly for this week's US Open. We are doing it tomorrow because, of course, that tournament starts on Thursday. So I mentioned yesterday that we were not entirely sure on what time we'd be hosting that just yet. That will be during our normal time slot tomorrow. So 2 p.m. Eastern, I will be posting the link into the Office Hours channel for that as soon as we get off here today. And if you have any questions about PGA DFS, about the US Open, about how to build lineups for your golf contest using SaberSim, go ahead and post them in that channel in the next 24 hours or so. And we will get to them live on stream tomorrow. I believe it will be me and Max talking a little PGA DFS on here tomorrow. So very, very excited for that. I'm very excited for the US Open. Excited to finally talk a little bit of golf here on stream. I know we haven't done so much of that yet. So very excited for that. Let's see. I think that is it in terms of my typical intro. Again, I mean, if you are watching this back as a recording and you want to ask some questions or you want to get involved, you're not sure where to start, just go ahead and shoot us an email, support@sabersim.com, with any questions you have. If you're looking to get involved in the Slack group, whatever you need there, we'll be happy to help you out. But we do have a few questions here in our queue today. I've got a handful that have come in through our support inbox, a handful in the Office Hours channel, and then a few interesting questions I think that were discussed in the MLB channel in Slack earlier this morning that I'm going to spend some time on. I think these are a lot of what we have today here are more open-ended strategy type questions as opposed to product demos or how to do certain things. So I'm going to take my time with a lot of these and spend a little bit of time here and discussing some of the nuance and maybe some things to look for with some of these questions. But we do have plenty of time here again today. Excuse me. So if you have a question, anything at all, or just something you're a little confused about, or even just something that you'd like for me to spend a little bit of time talking about, feel free to post it again. YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack is just fine. So with all that said, I'm going to go ahead and get us started here and pull up SaberSim. All right. Cool. And let me get my first question up here. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this already, but this question came in from Phantom in our Office Hours Slack channel. And he said, granted, the contests aren't as big compared to other sports, but would be interested in SaberSim strategies with NHL, particularly single game. Yeah, let's talk about this a little bit. So I'm fairly new to NHL. To be completely honest, this is probably really my first season where I really dived into it. So I will preface this by saying that I am by no means an NHL expert. I know we do have some serious NHL grinders in the community. So I know we're winding down on this season. So I'm going to take mostly a showdown approach in answering this question here today. But first off, I think prior to the start of next season, we'll definitely be looking to get some NHL content, get some other folks in to talk about that, maybe in the form of a strategy session, some tips for playing bigger NHL slates. But I have been playing these playoff showdowns quite a bit. I've been having some decent success with them, and I'm happy to kind of talk a little bit about some of the strategies I've been using for these NHL contests. And what you are probably going to find is they're not very different than a lot of the showdown content we've been creating already so far this season for NBA and baseball. I mentioned it yesterday. I think there was this exact same question came in, but from the format of a baseball conversation, baseball specific showdown tips. And we just did NBA showdown specific tips. And here we are doing NHL showdown specific tips. And I think really the answer here is that these aren't going to play dramatically different. The fundamental strategies that we're using for these kinds of contests, they have, I think I said yesterday, they have more in common with each other than they have different, right? So first off, I highly recommend going back and checking out that NBA showdowns video that we have up on our YouTube channel from 2 weeks ago, our strategy session, because we go into showdown specific strategy more in depth than I'm going to here. But there are 3 really big takeaways that come out of that video, and they are true of all showdown contests, really. So the first is to differentiate with your lineup construction. So we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. The second is to take aggressive stands with the chalk. We'll talk a little bit how to do that. And the third is to find upside, right? So I think in the form of NBA, we talked about minutes upside, players that if they get just a few more minutes than they are projected, they have a lot of potential upside. For baseball, we talked a little bit about the ways you can use relief pitchers. We'll talk a little bit about what maybe that looks like for hockey here. But first off, a few notes right off the bat. I think something that I've just been finding successful across the board, and again, I mentioned this yesterday as well, is using max salary as a way to just immediately differentiate yourself from the field by capping your maximum salary. So I've been finding some success here, bringing this back down to 49.5. I think, again, NHL is a more variant sport than basketball. I think it has some similar variants to baseball. I think if you wanted to drop this down even further to differentiate more, I don't think that would really hurt you. You can see how low we drop minimum salary, right? We think that there's profitable lineups that can be built as low as 35,000. So that's why we have that down there. So I don't think there's anything wrong with dropping this further, but I've just been dropping off 500 just to know that I'm not building lineups right at max salary and get a little different there. I've been keeping my smart diversity, no matter what contest I'm playing, at very high. That means we're using a single game simulation to determine projections for every player. We're really capturing some upside right out of the gate. And then what I have been doing, this is kind of my personal strategy. I think a lot of this comes because I'm playing some of these smaller contests, is I've been taking these both down. I think the impacts of correlation are accounted for in the single game simulations. The assists that take place when a goal is scored are already captured in that simulation data. So I don't really feel the need to have correlation on top of that. And then I've been handling my ownership fade in step 3 rather than having the builder handle it. 2 reasons. 1, I think it's a little bit easier for showdowns to understand where the chalk's going to be. And 2, I think it's difficult for our algorithm here at times to sometimes predict what I think is going to happen with ownership. So I've been handling that myself. And I'll show you, in addition to those things, a few things that we can do here after you run the build. So let's get an idea of what the kind of typical lineups start to look like. We'll let this build run. And remember, so what we're trying to do, we're trying to differentiate with our lineup construction. We're trying to build constructions that are different. So we've already done that a little bit by dropping max salary, but there's more we can do there. We're trying to make aggressive stands with the chalk, and we're trying to find some upside. So let's talk about this a little bit. So one thing I like to do just to get an idea of how the public is feeling about the game is we'll go right back to that Fantasy Labs dashboard. And I should have done this before. I like to look at just kind of what the lines are and how they're moving and get an understanding of what the public thinks. I think same as all these other sports, right? The public is just going to really latch on closely to Vegas, and they do things that you would expect based on what those Vegas lines look like. So right now we've got the Lightning at 3, the Islanders at 2.1. I think it's pretty clear what you're going to see are going to be common constructions. I think the Lightning goalie is probably going to be very popular, especially as a captain. I think Lightning skaters also are going to be popular, right? So uncommon constructions, we can just flip that right on its head. And you can use this for a lot of sports, right? This is true. Again, this is not an NHL specific thing, right? These are similar things that we do in other sports, but you flip that on their head. On that's head, we're only playing a single game, right? Anything can really happen here. That's the advantage of smart diversity. I'm now more interested in playing some Islanders skaters or even the Islanders goalie. And you can see, right, you're not even making a huge sacrifice in terms of what these players project as. Especially when we look at ranges of outcomes, right? So we look at some of the highest projected Islanders skaters. I showed this yesterday in the form of looking at hitters' ranges of outcomes. We can do a similar thing with skaters in hockey, right? So we'll look at the top Lightning players who are likely going to have a little bit of a higher potential ceiling because we, just like Vegas, are projecting them higher, but this curve is going to look very similar, right? And the field just does a poor job, I think, looking at a single game sample of actually assessing the possible ranges of outcomes, something that, again, SaberSim is kind of taking care of for you here when building lineups. So let's go back and look at our build here and see what kind of players we got out of this. Okay, so right off the bat, I mean, it looks like we got a lot of Tampa Bay skaters. We are getting some of the Tampa Bay goalie here at captain, right? Captain's a very easy way to find some differentiation. One thing that I like to do here, now that I have an understanding of what I think the field is going to do, remember, we turned ownership fade off, right? So this is an ownership fade agnostic build. It's building all the lineups it thinks are viable, is I will start to remove plays that I don't think have the appropriate leverage for the contest. So if you're playing a smaller contest, right, I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to chop off the chalky goalie. So the Lightning goalie, I think, is going to be a very popular goalie. I think that's an easy thing to remove from your pool and gain some additional leverage on the pool, right? Again, we're using tonight's game as an example, but you can use these principles on other contests. So I don't want to give the indication that this is the right way to play this slate or this is the thing you do every time. But I'm just using an example of differentiating from what I think the field is going to do tonight. I think from there, you know, if you were playing a bigger contest, I don't know how big these get at the high end, but if you needed some additional leverage, I think removing some of the most popular Tampa Bay skaters from your pool would also be an interesting way of doing this at captain, right? So we're getting some additional leverage on the field by going away from what the most popular constructions look like, right? So maybe we still allow some of these second line or, I mean, even down to like fourth line lineups here with these Tampa Bay skaters at captain, but you can see our most popular constructions now are some of the best Islander skaters, right? And what we've done here is we've taken an aggressive stand. We're going against, I mean, not only what Vegas is doing, but also equivalently what SaberSim would probably like us to do in a vacuum, right? We have Tampa Bay at 0.8 goals higher than the Islanders, right? SaberSim clearly favors Tampa Bay too. But for a single game sample, we're taking those aggressive stands with the chalk, right? And I've been finding some success with this kind of strategy overall. The other thing we mentioned here is these aren't the contests to play if you are uncomfortable with variance. And these aren't the contests to play if you're not very comfortable with losing, I mean, every entry that you play that night, right? Because we're searching for upside. We're not just searching to come up with a min cash lineup or a lineup that has a decent projection, right? We are trying to come up with a unique lineup that can win and win it uniquely, because that's where a lot of the EV is in these contests, is a solo takedown of first, right? So those are the constructions we're trying to build. If you aren't comfortable with having a night, I mean, if the Islanders, if a score similar to what Vegas projects is going to happen here is the outcome, you're going to lose with this kind of approach. But in a single game sample, if you get the opposite outcome here, you get a lot of leverage on the field. So very similar concepts that we've been having on NBA and MLB. I'll say it one more time: differentiate with your construction, take aggressive stands with chalk, and search for upside. That last point is kind of the last one I wanted to talk about. I think you gain a lot of that upside potential by having a smart diversity really high. You get to capture those single game simulation outcomes, those hat trick type games for the skaters in your lineups. I mentioned here at the start that I am not intimately familiar with NHL. I'm still getting kind of familiar with not only it as a DFS sport, but as kind of just something that I'm a fan of and watching. If you are an NHL fan and you're more familiar with these teams and what some of these line rotations look like, I think you can probably find some additional edge similar to what Max talked about by searching for minutes upside in NBA, by potentially looking for some skaters that may spend a little bit more time in the ice than they are being conventionally projected for. So I would say that's another place to go and maybe do a little bit more deep dive research, especially if you wanted to squeeze out a little additional edge here. That's something that I'm just not super familiar with. I allow the Sims to take care of a lot of that by having my smart diversity high and just assume kind of that I'm capturing a lot of that upside there already. But so hopefully that's helpful. Again, all these showdowns play very similar. I think when NFL comes, we're going to be having a lot of these similar conversations, right? How do I win NFL showdowns? Well, it's very similar to how you win any showdown. You build different lineup constructions, you take aggressive stands with the chalk, and you search for upside. But anyway, had fun answering that one. I've been enjoying these NHL showdowns quite a bit. Again, I really just been a good excuse for me to be watching a little playoff hockey. I've been having some success with this kind of strategy. So happy to talk a little bit about that. And if anyone else is a big fan of NHL or is playing a lot of NHL, or particularly if NHL is your main sport, I'd love to hear. Feel free to pop some thoughts into YouTube or into the Office Hours channel if you have some thoughts about maybe one way you've been having some success with these NHL Showdown contests. So spent a little longer on that than I expected, so I'm going to keep us moving right along. Again, if you have any questions at all, Office Hours channel on Slack, YouTube chat, I will get right to it. But I'm going to move us on to the next question I have here. And let's see. This one actually came in from our MLB channel. This was a comment actually just from Ruben here in our MLB channel. And he said, in a nutshell, is MLB DFS essentially taking a stance on a couple pitchers and rotating good stacks throughout your lineups based on ownership? And essentially is the biggest advantage you can gain when it comes to building lineups is getting the correct pitchers in a given slate. I wanted to talk about this a little bit because I think this is a common trend in DFS in general. And I think it comes from a world where optimizers don't account for the things that SaberSim does, like correlation and ownership and upside in the form of smart diversity, and requires users to enter a lot of rules and groups and stack types and things like that that we really just don't have to do here. That sports get boiled down to a few general statements of a heuristic, right? And this is one you'll hear, right? MLB DFS is best played by establishing a pitching pool and rotating your hitting stacks around it. Or for NBA, you know, these trends are similar. The optimal strategy is to lock in some value and rotate studs around them. You know, just various, I think every sport probably has one, various heuristics of just what somebody would do to simplify their DFS process using a traditional optimizer so that they could get lineups in time and not have to spend hours researching the slate intimately and be able to still build semi-successful lineups. But what is so cool about SaberSim is that we really don't have to do that. And we can start to look at the slate to slate variations and take advantage of what each slate presents to us on its own. And that's really what the nature of our test build is. We talk a lot about our content where we're talking about DFS process, about the value of running this test build. So if you haven't seen that before, really what a test build is you take settings that kind of fit generally what your contest might look like that night, and you run a build with default settings. I will typically update 2 projections very minorly just so I don't get that DK message. And we get an idea of just what the context of the slate looks like, right? And what you find if you run these over and over again and you play DFS often here is that the rules of the best way to play a certain sport fall apart really quickly because there's variance and there's variations in between each slate that by taking into account correlations, again, ownership and the upside of players, we can actually attack each slate differently, or at least provide SaberSim can provide an option of a different way to attack that is truly slate specific. So if we look at this right off the bat tonight, right, the conventional establish a pitching core and rotate your stacks around it isn't what SaberSim is recommending at first glance. Our most popular players are all Padres players who have, I think, the first 7 implied run total score of the year on both Vegas and SaberSim. And of 20 lineups, we're actually getting a 13 pitching core, 13 player pitching core, right? So quite a bit of a far cry away from the conventional establish a pitching core and rotate your stacks around them. That doesn't mean that you can't tighten up this. That's the point of step 3, right? Is that you could go in here and say, no, I want to play a tighter pitching core. Start chopping off some of the fat off the bottom here, which will allow us to tighten up at the top. And we've done this before, I think, on this stream here. But let's say we wanted to play a really tight pitching core and only play 4 pitchers. So let's go ahead and get to our top 4 pitchers. And we'll see what happens here. And you can still do this. We'll see. Okay, wait, let's see. Okay, so we have 4 pitchers. We've tightened up our pitching core. What will typically happen is we'll spread out our stacks a little bit more. San Diego's just projected so highly tonight that they're going to show up a lot, but you can still condense here a little bit. And that's fine. I'm going to reset this. But I guess really just the point that I really wanted to get across here is that the value of the test build is that we can get away from the conventional heuristics that you hear in the DFS space elsewhere, right? That this is the right way to build lineups for this kind of sport. We can handle that on a slate-to-slate basis with just a couple seconds of research, really. So we now have an idea, really, that the way SaberSim is approaching this slate here, out of the box, default settings, is to play quite a bit of Padres, spread out a little bit to some other stacks, but you can see, especially on the 5 stacks, we're pretty condensed on Padres for 20 lineups, and spread out at pitching. And that's not something that you could have really just established with a heuristic or a rule of thumb about how to play every slate. And that's true of every sport too, right? I can't think of another example off the top of my head, but you hear these sometimes. Or another one too, I guess, like even just staying on baseball, one I hear really often is that like you should always be paying up for that 10K pitcher. That's one that is like kind of conventional, that it always is worth paying up for the 10K pitcher, generally pairing him with some other value pitcher, and then you kind of fit in the bats that work around that. Again, that's the luxury we have here, is we don't have to think about these slates that way. Sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. Tonight, it doesn't make sense. Tonight, there's only one pitcher above 10K or even at 10K anyway. And that's Trevor Rogers. So not a great example, but that's, again, just something that we can avoid by having the luxury of an optimizer that thinks about these things. So Ruben, I don't know if you had a chance to tune in here. I think you had mentioned that you were going to watch it. If you have any questions or further thoughts about that, feel free to chime in or ask away. Again, I mentioned sometimes that the last thing I want to do here is take a question asked from somebody and kind of brush it away or answer it in a different way. And I feel like that's kind of what I've done again here. So I would say the last note I'll say is I don't think there's anything wrong with your approach if that's the way you want to handle contests. It's like if you want to play a tight pitching pool and rotate stacks around, right? SaberSim just as easily allows you to do that. But I think the luxury of the test build and the product is that you don't have to, and you can handle that on a slate to slate basis, right? I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving along here because I still have a few other questions that I think are going to take up some time. So I will go ahead and bring us back here. And I'm also going to pull up our Vegas board here because we've got another question about Vegas. All right, cool. So this one was from Keith. I don't know, Keith, if you are watching us live here. But this was a great question. This also came in through our MLB channel in Slack this morning. Keith asked, do people generally use the SS team run projections or adjust to the Vegas projections, which are usually quite different? Great question, Keith. This question does also come up quite a bit. I'm going to say... let me think about this. I think there's a spectrum of reasonable approaches here. And I think you should at least understand the impact of what you're doing when you're adjusting these and maybe why or understand some certain cases of why you might want to. I don't think there is anything necessarily wrong with at very close to lock adjusting SaberSim's projections to match Vegas because SaberSim's closing lines, even in baseball, are going to be fairly sharp. But what you should be aware of you are doing there is you are essentially getting your projections much closer to what the field is already going to do, right? We're searching for leverage. We're searching for edge on a slate. We're looking for fantasy points that other people aren't going to find in essentially is our goal in DFS play and GPPs. So by adjusting your team totals down or up to match Vegas accordingly, you are getting closer to that closer to the field. So you may be squeezing out a little bit of extra accuracy there if there's a case where Vegas is a little bit sharper on a game than we are. But you are also getting yourself much closer to the field, right? So you may be getting fantasy points that are more potentially, maybe a little bit more likely to hit, but also will be found by the field, right? So a few things that I think maybe can be a little bit more useful than that is searching and using Vegas as an overall signal to influence your play. One thing I always like to say, especially on a very big 15-game slate, is that we don't need to go out and find every edge. And what that means is there's 30 teams playing baseball here tonight, right? We don't need to have an edge or the leverage on every single one of them. So in practice, that means we can adjust certain teams more aggressively and leave other teams alone based on what we're seeing in signals from Vegas. So one thing I like to do, and we've done this on stream a few times now, let's see. I just saw a message pop up here, so I'm actually just going to look at this. Wesley said, I think it's important to remember Vegas lines are meant to attract bets, not just predict totals, if that makes sense. That is true. That is more discussed too in our sports betting strategy session that is up on YouTube. Max talks a little bit about the implications of that, right? Vegas is not attempting to actually predict game outcomes, right? But they can still be pretty useful as signals here. So I'm gonna keep kind of talking about what maybe ways we could look at signals. And I think the most apparent way is to think about Vegas lines as moving throughout the day, right? So this is our Fantasy Labs Vegas dashboard. We use this a lot. I think Andy mentioned that it is in our plan at some point to incorporate something like this into our own app. But for right now, this is free. This is a pretty good dashboard. It's interesting to look throughout the day at how certain teams move and whether or not they are moving towards or away from us, right? So you might say that, okay, Washington, we have at 5-1. Vegas only has them at 4-8. So I'm going to bump this down to 4-8, right? And again, I mentioned that's fine. You are getting a little bit closer to the field. But what is really interesting about the trend here is that Vegas has gotten closer to SaberSim throughout the day, right? And we have been above Vegas throughout the day, right? right? That is not what I would feel is a very concerning trend to me, especially considering now too that our implied run total is less than a half run off from Vegas. That's kind of another signal I typically use, is one being, are they moving in the opposite direction of us? And two being, are they a half run or greater away from us? So we can move on to some of these other games here. It looks like Yankees and Toronto are pretty similar. I'd be interested to see if we can find one where they are moving more dramatically away from us. Here's one. This isn't necessarily a dramatic case, right? But we do have the Mets at 4.9 runs, fairly bullish on them, probably semi-higher team total. And you can see that Vegas started here at 4.8, very close. And it has dropped just a bit. Again, we're not very far off. We're only 0.3 runs away, but it has moved in the opposite direction. So this might be an indication where maybe this is a team that you want to move. And I think it would be fine if you wanted to take the approach of just dropping to meet Vegas. I think an approach where you are just matching their movement is also fine. So taking down ours, 0.2, right? I wonder if there's an extreme version of this that I can dig up anywhere here. I'm going to do a very quick scan because I want to find something fast. Here's actually a pretty extreme version, right? So you have the Tigers here. They started at 4.2. They've moved down to 4. And we have them at 4.7, right? So began already a half run lower than us and now have since moved to 0.7 runs lower than us, right? This is one where I would definitely kind of flag as maybe an opportunity to make a move. And again, I just mentioned maybe you are coming down all the way to 4.0. Maybe you are just matching the movement and still being relatively bullish on the Tigers overall. You're still keeping some of that SaberSim edge. You're not getting all the way there. Or maybe you're just leaving it alone, right? I think the problem with going through and just adjusting all of these to match Vegas right before lock is you're basically going to reduce the potential edge of the SaberSim projections down to like 0. And I think what you would need to be doing after that is in your post-build process, intentionally making some lineups or intentionally capping exposure on chalkier plays down to make sure you're still capturing some of that opportunity, right? Like if we just, let's run another, actually we have a test build up. Let's see. So just running this with default settings, right? We hadn't adjusted any projections. We are getting a lot of Padres, just like everybody. But you'll typically find that there are some opportunities to get some teams here or some leverage in different ways that other players might not be. So let's look at what our team stacks look like overall, right? So we do have 3 Detroit stacks. They are all 3-piece stacks, right? We don't have, or this one is actually so we have a 3, a 4, and another 3-piece, right? Stacks that are probably unlikely for most other players to get, and stacks that you're unlikely to get if you just reduce the Detroit team down to 4, right? We have them at 4.7. If you reduce them down to 4, you'll probably get some other team, some other supporting stack, probably around 4.5 to 5.0 implied runs that were right even with Vegas that the rest of the field is also going to do. So like maybe a team like the Red Sox, right? We have them at 4.8. Vegas has them at 4.5. Players will probably use them as secondary stacks tonight. You are losing kind of I call it almost like a micro edge there by reducing that total. So what I typically like to do and what I kind of recommend players to try here is to go through, especially close to lock, right? We want to do this later in the day rather than earlier so we have the most up-to-date information and get familiar. You can even take notes. A lot of times I'll take notes as I'm doing this process and flag opportunities where either Vegas has started not with our... Well, actually, if Vegas has moved further away from SaberSim throughout the day, right? If they've gotten further from where the start was, looking at the implied and the live total, and flag that. And then second, if Vegas is more than a half run apart from any team, and flag that. And then from there, you can use your MLB knowledge that you yourself have. You can use other sources. You can use really whatever you want. Think about where you want your opportunities to capture and find some of the leverage on the slate are. You don't need to find every edge, right? I personally, it's Mike Minor on the mound tonight. I don't know if Detroit is my favorite stack. I haven't done a lot of research on this tonight, but just looking at this, I'm a little bit more inclined to be on Vegas's side here. But that doesn't mean that when we get to a team like, let's find another one. Oh, LA and Oakland, right? That was one I saw earlier. So we're fairly bullish on both LA and Oakland. I may be more likely to play and stick with something to stick with higher team totals that SaberSim has instead of adjusting those down to Vegas on another team, right? And that's why you're the edges and the way you're handling each individual game can amount to enough while still allowing you to have your impact on the team totals. So I wanted to really find an opportunity of like one team on here that I would adjust more, like increasingly in the direction that SaberSim is moving. Let me see if I can find an example of that. There's not one immediately jumping out to me, but anyway, I'll go ahead and leave that there. We've talked a lot about other ways you can use these Vegas totals here on office hours before. I think I keep getting a little bit better at it every time this question comes up. But what I recommend if you want some more information here is go back into some of those other office hours videos on our YouTube channel. They're all time-stamped, so you should be able to see when we're talking about Vegas totals. I also think they're in the title of most of those videos. You can find them pretty quickly. And I think, let's see, Keith, if you are watching, you have more questions about this, better ways you can squeeze out some edge in your process by looking at these totals, feel free to just ask away. I would say kind of broad highlights here is that you should always remember that when you move closer to Vegas, you are getting closer to the field, right? And use Vegas signals and SaberSim and your prior thoughts and your own independent research about the teams and the slates to kind of find a set of edges on a slate that you are comfortable with. And it doesn't need to be one big, sometimes a slate is better thought of as a series of kind of micro edges that add up to having leverage on the field, right? Like in the form of 15% minor Detroit stacks. But if you took last point on this, if you took a very aggressive stand on one of these teams, especially a team that was projected lower, so like, I guess back to the Nationals, right? That's not a bad example. We started at 5-1, Vegas started at 4-5, and they're slowly creeping up to us. So we're over Vegas, and we're getting a signal, I guess, from Vegas that the total has gone up on that team. Maybe one way to have enough edge on this slate would be to just bump them up significantly. And this would kind of give you license then to reduce some of those other teams or get other teams closer to Vegas, right? Maybe we don't need to be 0.7 runs off on the Tigers anymore because we're almost a full run over on the Nationals, right? And we got that kind of, again, this is an aggressive move. I'm aware of that. You're taking quite a shot here, but you're going to get yourself different, and it allows you to probably get closer to the rest of the field with the rest of the slate. And we at least have a signal that is sending us in this direction, right? So again, maybe something more appropriate would be to match Vegas's movement rather than to just go gunslinger here. Andrew mentioned, what do you consider significant? Again, it's hard. I don't always know. It's really hard to say. And it is a little bit slate to slate. dependent. I think anything above moving. So I think anytime a Vegas line moves a half run throughout the day, Andy has videos where he suggests keeping adjustments under 1.0. Is there a time to go bigger? I would definitely not go any bigger than 1.0. I think that's probably like the biggest move I would make. I think that would be like a strong signal to the builder that you want to bump up or bump down a team. I think you will absolutely at 1.0 adjustments start seeing an impact on your builds. I was going to say that I feel like Vegas lines moving a half run in either direction over the course of the day. So you can see we really only have two teams. The Padres have moved significantly. And the Reds also have 0.4 runs. I would say that to me is a pretty significant line movement. So I think that would also be a fairly significant line movement on the app, right? I would agree with what Andy said in those videos, keeping things under 1.0 total run adjustments. And you can kind of match the fervor that you're seeing from Vegas too. Like, I guess the Reds, I think the Reds are a good example where we started them above, where are they? We started above Vegas, right? And they've matched and now surpassed us. I think using that as a signal to maybe even bump this up and match the line movement that Vegas has seen today on the SaberSim line is another way to do that. And I would say this isn't an insignificant adjustment either. We'll probably see now. We'll probably see some Reds if we were to run, like let's run another 20 lineups and just see what we get. Oops. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised now that we've bumped this up if we start to see some Reds trickle into some of our supporting 3 stacks, maybe even some of our 4 stacks, could be even some 5 stacks like we saw with Detroit, right? And in this particular case, we took, especially now if you were to do something like to move Detroit back down, right? Then we're taking a team that Vegas started bullish on, that we saw a signal in reverse and dropped them down. And we had a team similarly that SaberSim started bullish on, but we've seen a signal from Vegas to push them up, and we did so. I think we still find some edge on the field, right? We didn't get necessarily closer. We got closer to Vegas on one team and further away from Vegas on the other team by using signals. We still probably have leverage on the field with these kinds of constructions. Let's just see what we get out of this, and then I will probably think about moving us on here. So we actually still have a lot of Detroit. I think what happened there is I didn't drop this one down. So I wanted to kind of use an example of dropping a team down that we were getting a signal in the opposite direction from Vegas while bumping another team up. And then let me rebuild this again one more time because I am just curious on what happens here. And I want to demonstrate this. So we'll let this do one more here. Wesley asked, let's see, while this is running, you prefer run total bump or exposure bump or same result, just different path? Totally same result, just different path. I handle this differently on a slate to slate basis, to be completely honest. Like there's slates where some of this stuff is a little bit kind of like it's okay to have a little bit of an like intuitive feel to your approach here. Like if the run totals are, why did that happen? Refresh. The run totals are naturally a little bit more. What happened? Let me try a hard refresh here. That was weird. Let's see. Give those a moment to go. Yeah, no, I change it up slate to slate. I think on a slate where I don't find that there's a natural way to make adjustments to team totals, or maybe on a smaller slate, or I'm not getting signals from Vegas that I think are useful to make adjustments, or signals from elsewhere, I will generally handle those slates a little bit more on the exposure side, right? I don't really know what happened here. But yeah, and then slates where I think there are, I think on the bigger slates, I'm probably more likely to rely on using projections editing more, especially team total projections. On smaller slates, I think I jump towards using the exposures more to mostly manage the chalk and make sure I'm not just getting the chalkiest plays. I'm going to go ahead and just close this here and try to start over with a fresh window. It seems like I had a little bit of a crash there. Okay. All right. It doesn't seem like that ran, that last build I tried to run here. But I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and keep us rolling here onto the next question. Thank you both to Andrew and Wesley here for asking some of these follow-up questions. That's exactly what we're hoping for with this stream. We want, especially, you know, it's not always easy for me to just hear myself kind of talk and understand where things might be confusing as I'm going through this. Sometimes I watch these videos back to get them up on YouTube, and I even realize myself, you know, that's probably not the easiest thing. I didn't really explain that in the clearest way. So at any point, if there are any follow-up questions or clarifying questions, or it seems like I'm not explaining something in a clear way, please just shout it out, and I'm happy to kind of answer questions where there are questions. So with that said, I think we've got our app back up here now. At least I think so. And I'll dive into our last question of the day unless something else comes in. Thank you for being patient with me here while I work this out. Figure out what's going on here. Okay. All right, let's bring this back. Okay. All right, so we're back. Last question of the day was from a user that came in through our support via email. And the question was basically how to get value out of step 3 and tweaking the exposure. So we've talked a lot about projections here now. And I guess, Wesley, this maybe is actually a good way to transition here and talk about how to get some value out of editing exposures. So I'm going to talk about a few things here. We'll let the build run here. We'll talk about things to think about really when you're looking at your final exposures, tweaking and finalizing your lineup. So give this just a moment here. Okay, let's pull this up so people know what we're talking about. Okay, so we're talking about strategy and things to think about when we're editing our exposures here in step 3. One thing that I like to do, and we've talked about this a little bit before, is to look at my entire pool of lineups. So we built 500 for the purposes of a 20 lineup pool, but we can actually adjust this to 500 and get an idea of all the players in our pool. We'll give this a second to adjust, and everything will adjust over. And one of the values of this right from the start here is getting an idea of what players are very heavily used in your pool and what players aren't, right? A common question we get is users that have gone in and set a bunch of exposures in step 3 and are starting to see that message that says they need to build more lineups. A common reason why that might be is we don't really have any here in this case, and I think it happens less with baseball. But if you have a significant exposure to one player in your entire lineup pool and then you attempt to X them out, it's going to put a lot of strain on the builder. There's not going to be a lot of lineups left, right? Say, for example, that we had 80% Tatis or something like that. If we X'd him out all of a sudden, that leaves us with only 20% of our original pool to even work with and can be very limiting. So it's a good idea right from the start to get an idea of what the builder wants to do. You can see it across its entire pool of 500. It is favoring San Diego stacks pretty heavily, but not overly committed to them. And it has a very wide pitching pool. From there, we can kind of come back down to 20 and then see how it's applying those lineups. And what we see is a much more significant investment into San Diego across just our 20 and still a relatively spread out pitching pool. I think a lot of the decision matrices that you have here thinking about step 3 come down to your risk tolerance, right? We look at a batter here. Let's look at our batters. We have 90% Trent Grisham, who at 4,400 projects for a mean projection of 11.61, hitting right in the projected 2 spot for the highest implied team total of the year in Coors. A remarkably good spot to be in. But if we click on him, we are going to see that his second most common outcome is 0 points at 15% of the time, followed closely by 5 or less points at 17% of the time, right? These hitters in baseball have a very high chance of failure. That's just the name of the game. They are very variant positions. And it may not be, you may not be the kind of player that wants to be that exposed to a players whose most 2 common outcomes are essentially his floor. And that's true of a lot of players. I think players are more likely to cap exposures on hitters, looking at capping exposures on hitters rather than pitchers, right? And that's something that would be totally fine to do, right? So, I mean, the optimizer is saying the optimal way to play the slate is to be very aggressive on our stands with the Padres, at least at this point in the day. But if we wanted to bring these down, I think 30 is something that I've done here in the past on stream. You can do that and start capping hitting exposures. And you're going to see this will have a feedback effect here where a lot of players will start dropping when you start dropping a couple, just because the optimizer wants to use them in stacks. But we can start dropping some of these down. And this is probably the most common way I use step 3 for baseball. And we're doing this too, let's not forget, with the confidence that this is going to work and we're not dramatically distancing ourselves from what SaberSim wanted to do, because even though we saw 90% Trent Grisham in our lineups, in our 20 lineups, we know that the Padres stacks are really only about 45% used in the full pool. So there's plenty of non-Padres lineups that the builder thinks are viable. And you start to see here now we've got access to some Washington, some Pittsburgh, some different stacks, and so on. You can do the same thing on pitching in either direction. You can cap some exposure if you want to spread out even more, right? Or you could condense your exposure if you want to spread out even less. We can do that for batters too, right? So we were just talking about a situation where we don't want to expose ourselves to a batter going 0 for 4, even in a smash spot. And so we're spreading out our batters. The converse of that, I guess, is having 90% Padres stacks, but failing to have, let's see, maybe we're missing someone, failing to have enough Will Myers. We only have 7 lineups with Will Myers, and he hits 2 home runs, right? That can happen too. And that feels equally bad when you say, well, I was so on the Padres. I mean, everyone's going to be on the Padres, but just as an example, I was so on the Padres and I still didn't win. We can also increase our upside, increase our risk by condensing even further in this step 3. So maybe we say 100% Padres 5 stacks, right? Surprising to me. That's only 2 additional lineups. I wonder if, Let's try it this way. That's really surprising to me. I didn't expect to see that at all. There surely are additional Padres 5 stacks in our pool, or additional Padres stacks at all. I wonder why. Let's just try to hit yes, and maybe it just needs to build a few more lineups. That's really surprising to me, though. I think, I mean, there are obviously more Padres stacks. I am surprised it wasn't able to just give us one more lineup to finish that out. Huh. I wonder why it doesn't seem to want to do that for any team. I may need to look at that. Maybe it's a weird something with the fact that I'm putting that at 100. But the point here, the broader point is that we could condense even further, or maybe say instead we want to have that approach with the Rockies, right? And we could condense our lineups significantly here, and it excludes situations where we were on the right team, the greatest percentage of our stacked teams, and then still failed to have a good night, right? So we can increase our upside and increase our risk on the step 3 as well. So I would say those are kinds of the things that I would really be looking at. I would say look at your entire pool right at the start here, get an idea of what the optimizer thinks are your entire pool of optimal lineups, particularly looking for players that are extremely highly exposed, right? Those are players that we're probably going to not be able to get away from very easily without going back to step 1 and adjusting projections. And then from there, determine really what your risk aversion is for the slate, right? Would you be frustrated by having 90% Trent Grisham and him going out and going 0 for 4? Because if he does, that's one of his most likely outcomes, right? Or would you be frustrated by having 90% Padres stacks, 85% Padres stacks, and then having the wrong Padres in maybe just the lineup that is winning, right? That's one of the former there is playing a more risk-averse strategy, and the latter is playing a more risk-neutral, upside-focused strategy, right? And that's the way you should really be thinking about this. So the last note I will say here, I know we're getting close to the end, is that the extent to which you are exposed to a certain player in your pool is driven heavily by smart diversity, right? The higher your smart diversity is, the fewer sims we use to determine a player's projection in building each individual lineup. The higher your smart diversity is, the lower your general exposures to your highest exposed players are going to be, right? So with that said, this is another stage where I don't feel like you need to do something here in step 3, right? Don't feel like you need to add value here. You are really helping the product sort and select lineups with what you're doing here. You're not rebuilding new lineups. So the smart diversity is being at its defaults is going to give you exposures that we think make sense for the contest that you've selected. That said, obviously you can condense or widen your exposure as you feel fit that matches your risk kind of portfolio for the slate. But this isn't necessarily something where you need to feel like you have to be making moves here, because your general level of exposure here will match what you've selected in your entry limits and your entrance by determining a smart diversity, right? If we're playing the 150 max, maybe there's a huge tournament tonight, right? Smart diversity is going to be very high. The net impact of this, I'm not going to run this build because we're really close on time here, is that the highest exposed players in the pool are going to be actually lower, right? Because we're playing with a lot more lineups. We're playing against a lot more entries, and we can be over the field, and we can have a significant amount of lineups that maybe have someone like Trent Grisham without having 85% of 150 lineups having Trent Grisham, right? So the last thing to think there. Wesley also mentioned, I found building 100 or 200 lineups, which makes 1,500 player pool, then tweaking. Yeah, I do that too, especially for some of my test builds. And typically anything I'm doing for my own independent research, I will build at using some median sliders like 20 max or even 150 max, and then just setting this to build me 150. I don't play as many 150 maxes, but I kind of like to start a lot of my research for a slate from the standpoint of if I was building 150 lineups, and then from there, it will typically give you a 1,500 lineup pool to work with. So you get a lot of more information there. Leslie said, thanks for all the info and good luck. You too. Thank you for being a part of the stream today and asking some questions. We're getting pretty close to the end here, so I will go ahead and wrap this up. We will be back again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, me and Max talking a little bit of golf for our U.S. Open Golf Majors strategy session. Again, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you have any questions about golf, if you play every golf tournament and every showdown there is, and you have some questions that you'd like to ask, pop them into the Office Hours channel on Slack. If you have never touched a golf tournament in your life and you saw those awesome DraftKings contests in the lobby and you want to get involved and need to know where to start, pop some questions in the Office Hours channel and Slack. We'll get to it. I'm really excited for this tournament. I'm really excited for that show tomorrow. So please tune in. And then we will be back on Office Hours again, 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. At that point, probably all sweating our lineups that we built for the golf tournament. But we'll be back again on Thursday talking about whatever you guys want. I will get this recording up on YouTube before the end of the day today here, so you can watch it back. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and watching and asking questions. We had a good show today, and we will be back again later this week. So in the meantime, take care. Good luck, everybody. We'll talk tomorrow. See ya.